is the second of a four-part podcast series that we are hosting during the month of February. I'm your host, David McCartney. I serve as the University Archivist here at the University of Iowa. My office is in the main library. I'm in the Department of Special Collections and University Archives. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I started in this job back in January of 2001, and that means I've been chronicling the university's history for the past 20 plus years now. Readers of the Iowa Magazine may be familiar with my Old Gold column, which usually appears in the back of each issue, where I've been able to share some of these remarkable elements of our collections with readers for more than, about the last 12 years or so in total. Since 1847, the University of Iowa has broken barriers and blazed new trails as a beacon for learning, creativity, and collaboration. Today's event is part of the university's celebration of our 175-year history, and I'm honored to be your host of this four-part series. We've identified a mix of faculty, staff, and alumni to be featured throughout our series this month, with each session highlighting areas of distinction for the university, both during different points of its history, as well as opportunities for future growth. Each session has live closed captioning, and each session will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel at a future date. We encourage you to share the session with your Iowa friends and family who might not be able to join us today. Last week, we heard from Liz Crooks from our Pentecrest Museums, Rusty Barcelo on our university's legacy of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and Dean Sarah Sanders on the remarkable early history of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. If you missed last week's session, we did record it, and we hope to add it to our YouTube channel later this month. Today's session is on breaking barriers, arts, athletics, and medicine, and we'll be focusing generally on the first half of the 20th century today, from 1898 to 1947, the post-war period. The University of Iowa frequently travels rare air, whether it's fielding the nation's first Black intercollegiate athlete, establishing the country's best writing program at a public university, or developing breakthrough medical treatments. And we're joined today by three remarkable alumni guests whom I'll introduce to you throughout the program. You can submit questions at any time for any panelist using the Q&A functionality. We are covering a lot of content today, but we will try to ask as many questions as we're able and as time allows. So to get us started and to kind of get us into the mood, I thought I would share with you a few nuggets from the university archives. Last week, I opened with this quotation, and I'd like to share it again today. I think actually I'll do this for all four of our sessions when we think of tracing our roots as an institution. The University of Iowa was established by the General Assembly of Iowa in 1847, just weeks after statehood. And it was, I believe, the second act of legislation passed in the what is now the old Capitol. Iowa City was indeed the state capital at that time. But it took a few years. Classes did not open actually until about 1855. And the first report of the faculty to the Board of Trustees was submitted 3 years after, in 1858. There was much optimism, and there was certainly a great deal of reason for optimism in which we attempted to establish ourselves as a public university. And I'd like to quote from that initial report. We regard it as no small honor to have been the first laborers, the first working faculty organized in an institution in which we believe is destined at no distant day to take a high and noble stand among similar institutions in our land. That's quoted from our first faculty report of the faculty to the State University of Iowa Board of Trustees, prepared in 1858. And it was quite prophetic. There were certainly reasons to think that the university was on course for setting new directions in public higher education. And in keeping with our theme today of breaking barriers and creating new frontiers of research and scholarship, I thought I might share a couple of anecdotes from the archives, and specifically from recent columns I've written for Iowa Magazine. In the realm of medicine, the first decades of the 20th century were, as we all know, ravaged by a global flu epidemic. And a gentleman by the name of Richard Shope, who earned his MD degree here at Iowa in 1924, was instrumental in laying the groundwork for the development of vaccines to attack viruses. And it can be argued that without Richard Shope's preliminary research during the 1920s, both here at Iowa and later in his position as a research scientist at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research at Princeton, he laid the groundwork with the development of vaccines during the 1930s, when he recognized in his research that bacteria was not at the root of the 1918-19 global pandemic, but rather a virus. And this is not a small detail. This was a significant breakthrough in recognizing how research scientists could then develop vaccines that would attack identified viruses. And the fact that this was recognized fairly soon after the global pandemic of 1918 and 19 it's quite clear that the University of Iowa's impact was quite significant. In the realm of athletics, we are now more familiar with the name of Duke Slater, Frederick Wayman Duke Slater, who earned his Bachelor of Law degree here at Iowa in 1928. He received his first national honors as an offensive tackle for Iowa's football team. A sophomore during the 1919-1920 season, Slater's best years were yet to come. He culminated as a senior in 1921 when the Hawkeyes were led to a Big Ten title. We recognize Duke Slater today not only with a bas-relief sculpture on the north side of Niall Kinnick Stadium, but also the field has been now named in his honor. Duke Slater went on to a remarkable judicial career in Chicago, serving as a municipal judge for many, many years. The University of Iowa is also historically a leader in the arts, visual arts, creative writing, performing arts, and I want to take a moment to recognize that this spring will mark the 10-year anniversary of the death of Elizabeth Catlett. Elizabeth Catlett, at age 25, was among the first 3 students here at Iowa and in the nation, for that matter, to receive the Master of Fine Arts degree. That was in 1940, about 15 years after the University of Iowa became the first university in the United States to recognize creative works in lieu of written works to qualify as master's or other advanced degrees. Ms. Catlett was also the first African-American woman in the United States to earn this distinction in receiving the MFA. Her sculpture, Negro Mother and Child, was created in 1939 in the course of her graduate studies, I should say. And the sculpture was accepted as her qualifying creative work, not only for her degree, but also for placement at the American Negro Exposition in Chicago. After she completed her degree at Iowa, she taught at Dillard University in New Orleans, historically Black institution. If I may quote from critic Michael Brenson, her sculptures convey a deeply human image of African Americans while appealing to values and virtues that encourage a sense of common humanity. Well, those are just a few of the individuals that have allowed the University of Iowa to create its reputation as a university that breaks barriers. And right now, it will be my pleasure to introduce to you the first of our three speakers this afternoon. Lan Samantha Chang is a proud University of Iowa alumna, earning her MFA in English through the Iowa Writers Workshop. Professor Chang holds the position of Elizabeth M. Stanley Professor in the Arts at the University of Iowa, and she is the fifth director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She is the first woman and the first Asian American to hold that position, and she has been fundamental to the increase of racial, cultural, and aesthetic diversity within the program, mentoring a number of emerging writers. She is also a published author, and her newest book, we're delighted to say, The Family Child, was just released this month. Congratulations, Dr. Chang. And with that, we will turn it over to you. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. This is a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you about the Writers' Workshop. I am only the sixth director of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. It's an unusual institution in that way, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my five predecessors at this time. Um, you know, the workshop, being part of the workshop is always a fascinating experience. At this point, we are, really the earliest writing program at the University of Iowa and the foundation of the Writing University. Um, the University of Iowa is the host of probably the only creative writing program famous enough to feature as a plot device on not only one, but two primetime series simultaneously. Those of you who saw the Girls episodes set in Iowa City may not have realized that admission to the Iowa Writers Workshop was a plot device also in the TV show Mike and Molly in that same year. The Writers Workshop is the first creative master's program in the U.S., and I'm here to tell you a little about its history. I'll start around the turn of the 20th century. So, back in 1897, the University of Iowa held its first creative writing class, which was taught by George Clark and titled Verse Making. By introducing a class such as verse making, the University of Iowa began to play with the idea that verse and the craft of writings are things that could be practiced, honed, and taught, rather than byproducts of innate talent. Later, Clark Fisher Ansley would teach a course on short story form that led Edward Piper to create and teach his own poetics class. And by 1922, Dean Carl Seashore created a new model of academic study when he introduced creative theses into the graduate college. The School of Letters soon thereafter offered courses during the semester in which students could be taught by resident and visiting writers. All of these university level steps toward constructing a creative writing education primed what was to become the Iowa Writers Workshop. The Iowa Writers Workshop, was founded in 1936 by Wilbur Schramm and Norman Forster. The workshop would become the first creative writing program in the country, and Schramm was the first director of the program. Under his leadership, Schramm sought to gather writers of fiction and poetry to teach them the craft of writing under the tutelage of experienced teachers. Schramm's workshops were informal. A small group of students would convene at his house to discuss student writing. There was no workshop schedule. There was no building like today's Dye House. In his tenure as director, Schramm encouraged students to study the work of other writers, and he brought very practiced and excellent creative writers to teach at the workshop, encouraging a new critical approach to reading and writing analysis, which involves a very close reading of the text. And one of the interesting things about the writer's workshop is that we do a close reading of the student's work as well as outside texts. In 1941, the first Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing was awarded to a graduating student. At that time, Schramm was on a leave of absence to fight in World War II. Paul Engel took over as the second director of the workshop. Engel himself was an Iowa native. He grew up in Cedar Rapids and he was the son of a horse trader, which is a little bit like being a car salesman, I think. He was an Iowa native and received a master's degree in creative writing from Iowa. Before assuming his 24-year tenure as director, he had won the Yale Series of Younger Poets Award, and he was considered one of the most influential poets of his time, but he also had an extraordinary talent for administration. He was aware of and discussed what he saw as the paradox of the workshop. He stated that the aim of the workshop was to give, quote, the writer a place where he could be himself, confronting the hazard and hopes of his own talent, while at the same time he could, quote, knock or persuade or terrify the false tenderness toward his own work out of the beginning writer. During Engel's tenure, enrollment in the workshop began to grow, and workshops were split into fiction and poetry, and courses such as form and theory were added. Form of poetry and form of fiction still exist today as graduate courses. The students at the workshop lived in temporary Quonset huts, or they lived in temporary tin buildings at the time called huts, that were located near the student union, and writers such as Vance Borgelli, John Behrman, and Hortense Kalischer were on faculty. Interestingly, after World War II, a number of students came to the workshop, former members of the military, and changed the culture of the program a great deal at the time. The classes were also held in Quonset huts. From 1965 to 1969, George Starbuck served as the director of the workshop. During Starbuck's tenure, American culture and politics seemed to be abandoning literature more and more. At the time, Senator John McClellan said, "I don't think a book of short stories or fiction is going to be of any great value or produce results." And magazines such as Harper's and the Atlantic Monthly began slashing the number of stories they published per issue. But always at the Iowa Writers Workshop, writing and literature are at the heart and center of everything that's done. And I think that one of the great values of the workshop is that we've been able to sustain the value of American literature from decade to decade. John Leggett was the director from 1969 to 1986. During his 17-year tenure, the workshop became even more well-known. The student body grew younger following the group of students who came to study after the war. Some students arrived straight out of college. Minimalism was the literary trend at this time. Reagan was president. People were grappling with politics, war, and class more explicitly in their work, and some of the inimitable writers that came from the workshop during this time included Michael Cunningham, Gishgen, and Ethan Kanan. Frank Conroy served as director from 1987 until his death in 2005. Conroy was an accomplished writer who was a National Book Award finalist for his memoir Stop Time. During Conroy's tenure, applications to the program fiction and poetry soared from 500 annually to over 800, the 90s saw a boom of memoirs and a new look at sincerity in the classroom. I myself have been director of the workshop since 2006. It's been my goal to continue creating a community in which very strong emerging writers are able to make writing into the center of their time and their lives here in Iowa City. It's also been my goal to equalize funding and to make the student population reflect the diverse and changing population of today's U.S. Today, the Iowa Writers Workshop remains the first and best program in the country, truly the only program of its kind. Faculty and graduates affiliated with the Writers Workshop have won 29 Pulitzer Prizes, including 18 won by alumni since 1947, which, when I calculated it, came out to about one every 4 years. 8 U.S. Poets Laureate have been workshop graduates, including the current Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo. The workshop is not only very visible among the lists of literary award winners, but it is, as you may know, present in popular culture, television shows, and crossword puzzle clues. The community of writers at the workshop comes from all over the U.S. and the world, and we are all thrilled to be here in Iowa City. Thanks.
Sam, thank you so much for joining us. Please, if you could stay on, because we do have a couple of questions. I would like to share these with you now, and I think you'll appreciate both of these. First is, how does your work as a professor mentoring aspiring writers influence your own writing?
Oh, this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately with the publication of my most recent book, which shows a radical departure in style and subject matter in some ways from my previous books. And I think that I've been able to sort of hone my voice by being exposed so frequently to very talented um, writers and also to my colleagues on the faculty. I think it's an incredible, the workshop is an incredible incubator of thought, and everybody comes into the program. Everyone who comes into the program will not stay the same in the way they think about their own practice of writing, and including, I think, myself, the director. It's been an incredible experience. It's been extraordinarily enriching for my work, despite the fact that it takes up a lot of time.
It's an interesting role to be in because, as you said, not only mentoring, but doing your own creative work. I think that's a really interesting duality, and that's not something I've given much thought to, but it's certainly something that is unique to, especially to the Iowa Writers Workshop.
I think so. I,
Yeah,
I, I think it's unique to this particular community set in a town where writing is so important because we're not the only writing program at the university. So the town is filled with writers. You bump into, writers at the grocery store when you're looking for a salad, ingredients for a salad. You just feel infused with this belief that creative writing is important, and it's very inspiring for everyone.
indeed it is. I have a question from a participant who wants to know what James Allen McPherson's role was at the workshop. I know he taught for many years and was, again, quite a remarkable mentor, as I understand.
Jim was first and foremost, he was an extraordinary writer. He was one of the first writers to receive a MacArthur Genius Award. He was in that first group of geniuses. He also received a Pulitzer Prize, and he was the first African American writer to receive a Pulitzer Prize. And we were lucky to have him with us at the workshop for many, many years, about 2 decades. I myself was his student, and he was a very gentle man, a very quiet man, and a very witty person. And his sense of humor wasn't entirely politically correct. He had grown up, in the South during Jim Crow, and he had seen and been part of the civil rights movement and come to live in Iowa City in this enclave of like very sort of, I would say, well-thinking people, but he had this way of sort of gently poking fun at everyone, not just, you know, not just those who are usually made fun of. So he was an equal opportunity um, jokester, and he brought to class what he brought to class for me was kind of a more diverse way of looking at literature. He was interested in um, inspirations from other cultures, for example. And he was particularly interested when I was studying at the program in Asian literature, and that was very helpful to me. And he put some thoughts into my head that I think are only beginning to bear fruit for me now, 30 years after I was in the program. He's a wonderful teacher.
That's wonderful to hear, and that's an affirmation of my knowledge of him, and it's certainly a wonderful affirmation. Just one more question, and then we'll be moving on to our next speaker. As mentioned earlier, you are an alumna of the workshop. How did you first hear about the workshop? Whether
Okay.
perhaps at an earlier time when you were in even high school?
Okay, this is a whole story, but I grew up in Wisconsin, and I grew up in a town called Appleton. During my eighth grade year, my English teacher pulled me out of class and said, "There's a young man, a poet, who's teaching special creative writing classes in our school district this year because he applied for a grant that would enable him to go from class to class in the public schools of Appleton and teach creative writing. Do you want to meet with this person?" She could tell, I guess, that I was bored in English. And so one day a week, I left class and met with Mr. Monroe Lerner, who now is still a teacher. He lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Um, and he had me read and told me, how to different exercises to try, and looked at my work. And one of the things about Mr. Lerner is that he was a very recent graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. So when I was in eighth grade, I heard about this program. Never thought that I would have the opportunity to come here and study. But when I was in my mid-20s and realized that a more professional track was not for me, much to my parents' dismay, I thought about the Writers Workshop and applied.
We're so glad you did. Thank you very
Me too.
much. Well,
Thank
thank you. We'll move on to our next speaker, but before we do, I should note that we are getting quite a few questions in, which is wonderful. We'll be introducing additional questions as time allows after the last of our three speakers has appeared. So we'll be doing, we'll get to those questions as best we can in the time allowed. But let's move on. I am very pleased and excited to introduce you to our next guest, Quinn Early. Quinn is a proud alumnus who received his bachelor's degree in art in 1987. Now, although he has strapped on pads for 4 NFL teams, you might remember him as a wide receiver for the Iowa Hawkeyes. Quinn served as the team captain, and he was named to the first team All Big Ten. Although his career has taken him away from football and into movies, he's a professional stunt double now, which I would add to my list of cool occupations. He has always stayed interested in the Hawkeye athletics program. Tonight, he's going to talk about a recent project he's completed involving Frank Kinney Holbrook, Iowa's first Black intercollegiate athlete, and the film The Stories of Giants that came out last year. I'm sorry, The Shoulders of Giants came out last year. And Quinn, it's an absolute pleasure to see you again. I remember when we met out on the field for your documentary production last year, and I'm so glad you can join us tonight.
Absolutely. And David, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this this process. I think it's a great thing that you guys are all doing. And, I'm humbled to have been invited to participate. Just a little bit of history about myself. Grew up in Great Neck, New York. I'm from Long Island. Just had really humble beginnings. Fortunately, I had the athletic ability to warrant the University of Iowa giving me a scholarship to be able to be a two-sport athlete actually at Iowa. I played football and ran track. And I just have to tell you that the biggest accomplishment that I'm proud of during my days at the University of Iowa, and I before I get into talking about the documentary, in the documentary, there's a section where I talked to two of my best friends, Robert Smith and Carrie Burt, who, we went from teenagers into manhood together as we, played football. We were teammates and went to school at Iowa. And, what we did was, we all held each other accountable as far as going to class and getting our grades and graduating. And, I'm pretty proud of that accomplishment because Lord knows I wasn't the best student, but I worked extremely hard and I got it done. And it was just, it was important. And that's something that we passed on. We paid it forward to the younger players. And I think, they've really done a good job of continuing that trend. And I've actually come back and spoken to the current football team a couple of times just about the importance of not relying on your athletic abilities, but being able to do other things that will possibly make you successful. So I'm really extremely proud of that. And like you said, I had the opportunity to play for 12 years in the NFL. And just being able to accomplish all of the things that I've accomplished, is just, I'm extremely humbled by it. I always tell people that, when you have adversity or someone doesn't believe in you or someone tells you no, then you always use that negative energy as fuel to power your rocket to where you want to go. And Lord knows I've been told no many times. And that has always just made me go harder. So over the last 11 years, as David mentioned, I've been a stuntman in Hollywood. Totally random how I got into that. A friend of mine was a producer, asked me if I wanted to be in his movie, and really the rest is history. But over the last few years, I've started to write. I've written 5 screenplays, and I came across the story of Frank Kinney Holbrook, who was the first Black athlete out of the state of Iowa to attend the University of Iowa in 1895. He was from Tipton. And what's really interesting about the story is, well, first of all, let me go back for a second. I was called by a movie producer. They were going to do a movie about Niall Kinnick. I started to do my own research, and I totally stumbled on Frank Kinney Holbrook by accident. And what I did was I actually wrote a screenplay based on his life. But I realized after speaking to many people that I needed to tell his story now. What was interesting was the fact that not that many people had heard of Frank Kinney Holbrook. Everybody knows who Duke Slater is. And, there are a lot of great pioneers, not just in athletics, but also academically, from the University of Iowa. Alexander Clark, for example, who graduated from, I believe, in 1868. He helped with voting rights for young Black men and Black people in general back then. And he also got the people of Iowa to allow minorities to go to the elementary schools. His daughter, Susan Clark, she used to have to walk around the school where all the white children went, and she had to walk 5 miles to get to her school every day. And he was really a pioneer in many ways. So that's just an example. But back to Frank Kinney Holbrook, his father was a runaway slave. He ran from his captors when he was 12 years old, and he ran into the Union Army. And he met a gentleman named Captain Lloyd Dillon. Lloyd Dillon was from Iowa City. He took in James Holbrook, who was Frank Kinney Holbrook's father. And James Holbrook valeted for Captain Dillon through the Civil War. And after the war, Captain Dillon brought him back to Iowa City. And James got a job. He worked there. Once he grew up, he moved to the neighboring town of Tipton. And he got married and had a family. And his son was Frank Kinney Holbrook. What's really interesting about the town of Tipton I don't really talk about this in the documentary just for time's sake, but what a really interesting fact is the fact that they were primarily a Quaker town. And in the Quaker religion, they truly believed that all men were created equal. They didn't see color. So the family was extremely accepted by the people of Tipton. And in fact, when it was time for Frank to transition from high school to college, the people of Tipton paid for him. They got together and pooled their money and paid for him to go to the University of Iowa, which was really, really interesting. And in fact, when I was back in Tipton, I was shown a home where there was an Underground Railroad right there in Tipton. So it's just a really interesting story. He attended the University of Iowa. He played football. He ran track. And in 1896, he led the Iowa Hawkeyes to their first ever conference championship. And, I'm proud to say that, since starting this process, he's been inducted into the Iowa Hawkeye Athletic Hall of Fame. And I was fortunate enough to be able to represent him at that ceremony. So it was just a really great thing. And then I also wanted to let everybody know that on Saturday, February the 19th, I'm going to hold a charity event in Des Moines at Hope and Elam Church. And for those who can't make it, I know that everybody's spread out. And so there's the flyer right there. For the people who can't make it, the Hope and Elam Facebook page will be showing the event, and we're going to show the film, and 100% of the proceeds that is raised for this event will go towards building a monument of Frank Kinney Holbrook in the town of Tipton. So that's the goal there. And I really look forward to the event, and I really look forward to furthering my projects. What I'm doing right now is I'm working on a series of documentaries that will highlight the achievements of Black pioneers in American sports history whose stories have yet to be told. So I'm about 75% done with my next documentary. So I hope everybody will be looking out for that. And if you just wanted to go on and watch The Shoulders of Giants, you can go to frankkinneyholbrook.com, and it's only like $4 or $5 to watch the documentary. And the proceeds for viewing the documentary there, 100% of that money goes to my Alzheimer's Foundation, which I started in my late mother, Dr. Ann Early's name. She unfortunately passed away from Alzheimer's. So I really appreciate the support, and I look forward to sharing this project and more projects with everybody.
Well, thank you so much. I always learn something from you about Frank Kinney Holbrook. Even when I go back and look at your documentary, I see something new each time I see it, and it's really a tremendous production. I just wanted to, if I may, we'll get to a couple of questions for you in a minute, but before we do, I just wanted to mention again the website that Quinn mentioned is frankkinneyholbrook.com. And the event in Des Moines, once again, it'll be on Saturday, February the 19th, from 2 until 4:30 in the afternoon at Hope Elam Church at 2500 University Avenue in Des Moines. And this will be an event to raise funds for the foundation that Quinn mentioned. And there will be a screening of gosh, how many awards have you won already? It's really...
I've actually won 20 film festival awards for the project. And I don't want to ruin this, but I'm talking to a streaming service right now. They're going to show it, and hopefully it'll lead to some bigger and better things. It's all about just sharing the history that is really interesting history, but hasn't been told yet. So I feel very fortunate to be able to tell these stories.
Wonderful. I have a couple of questions here for you from our audience. Alexander Clark, you mentioned Alexander Clark and also his father, both from Muscatine, and they were very early African-American scholars here at Iowa, both in the law school. Could that be your next project, perhaps?
It could be. There's so many. Maybe you and I should have a conversation about some of the potential projects. But, there are just so many interesting stories. And I'll tell you what's really great about the University of Iowa is they were they've always been very progressive as far as, minorities coming to school there. Now, obviously back then there were problems, there was racism, all that stuff, but at least, they had the opportunity to go there and make something of themselves. And, you look at an Alexander Clark, you look at a Duke Slater, you look at some of and the list goes on and on. These gentlemen they went on to become lawyers and judges and doctors and all of these amazing things. And, doing it while going through all of this adversity that they had to face. So, it's a pretty amazing thing. And, again, I'm proud to be, an Iowa Hawkeye and be able to share these stories.
Has your research into the history of Iowa athletics affected or impacted your reflections on your own athletic experience?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was at the university, I lived in Slater Hall, had no idea who he was. I knew, yeah, he's an old school guy. He used to play. Look at the funny uniform he used to wear. That was about the extent of it, right? I was more worried about, what 19, 20-year-olds are worried about, right? But in reflecting and then learning and then, gaining an interest in the history, of the University of Iowa and minorities at the school, it definitely made me reflect on my time there. And I have to tell you, I had an amazing time at the University of Iowa. Were there instances where there was, small pockets of racism? Sure, there was. But overall, I had an amazing experience. And like I said earlier in my talk, that I've always used any negatives that have come along or any adversity that came along on my journey, I always use that as fuel just to make me go harder and just to make me push harder. And again, being told no and being told you're not going to be able to, you're not big enough, you're not fast enough, you're not smart enough, all of the things that we hear, and it's easier to believe the bad stuff, right? I always used all that as fuel to help me to be successful. And, just learning these stories helped me really reflect and appreciate the time that I had at school, because these guys didn't have it probably as easy as I did when I was complaining and saying, poor me. Imagine what they went through. And I talk about that in the documentary. So I'm very thankful and very fortunate to have been able to have the experiences that I've had.
And thank you very much. And again, we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you in Des Moines in about 10 days, I guess. And also look forward to viewing your documentary and future documentaries that you'll be producing. Thanks so much for joining us. Absolutely. I have to slip in a note, if I may, about a book that I think is very apropos to what Quinn had just addressed. And it came out in 2016, published by University of Iowa Press. It's entitled Invisible Hawkeyes, and it's based on the 1950 work Invisible Man. The book was co-edited by Michael Hill and Lena Hill, both former members of the faculty here at the University of Iowa. And the book is a collection of fascinating essays about the experiences of African Americans at Iowa in the first 30 or 40 years of the 20th century, primarily in the arts and in athletics, and how Iowa became a northern magnet for particularly African-American students from the Deep South. I recommend it highly. Again, it's called Invisible Hawkeyes, and the author, or the editors, I should say, are Michael Hill and Lena Hill, published by University of Iowa Press in 2016. We'll move on to our next guest now, Pat Winokur, who serves as the Executive Dean of the Carver College of Medicine and as a professor of internal medicine on infectious diseases at the University of Iowa. She is also a proud alumna, completing her residency and fellowships here at Iowa. And Dr. Winokur has joined us today to share a bit about the intersection of teaching and healthcare that occurs within a university teaching hospital, its origins here at Iowa, and how that impacts her work even today. Dr. Winokur, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. So I actually am going to use a little bit of visual prompts so you can see some of the history of the College of Medicine and the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. So Tony, you want to load those up? Great. So it is always hard to follow such talented speakers, but hopefully you're getting a taste of the University of Iowa then and now, and from a variety of pictures, from the writer's workshop to athletics and now to medicine. So next slide. We are just a little bit younger than the other parts of campus. Our history started in 1870, and then a couple of years ago that marked our 150th anniversary instead of the 175th. And in 1870, the medical education department opened at the University of Iowa, and one of the things that was noteworthy about that opening is that it was opened as a coeducational program, open to men and women, and at that time there were 37 students, 8 of whom were women. So we're very proud of that fact. Next slide. What we didn't have for another 20 years was actually a hospital. At the early times, we actually collaborated with the Sisters of Mercy hospitals, and it wasn't until 1898 that we actually built our first university hospital, and it was one of the first university hospitals on the west side of the Mississippi. At that time, it was a 50-bed hospital that was opened at the cost of $55,000. Now, many of you have probably been watching the news, and we are getting ready to expand our footprint into North Liberty, building about a 50-bed hospital for a cost of closer to $400 million. So a fair difference from the 1890s. Next slide. One of the things we're also very proud of is we actually have been looking for ways to improve diversity from way back when. In 1907, our first Black physician graduated. It was Edward Carter, and he went on to practice in what is now a historic township that doesn't exist anymore, but it's Buxton, and it was a coal mining community in south central Iowa. So another noteworthy accomplishment. And again, something that remains a very important part of the College of Medicine today, which is trying to improve the diversity of physicians that are practicing around the United States and in Iowa in particular. Next slide. One of the things that was also notable about the study of medicine at the University of Iowa is early in the 1900s, we actually adopted the concept that you needed to bring science into the teaching of medicine. We opened the first state hygienics laboratory, and this today is one of our homeworks. For many of you who have been trying to get tested for COVID-19, your tests are sent to the state hygienics laboratory here on the University of Iowa campus. But in 1904, that was special. It was set up to really begin to evaluate infectious diseases like diphtheria, typhoid, rabies, things that were scourges in the 1900s. Next slide. Now, the Flexner report is a very important report in the field of medical education. It was published in 1910, and it was a fairly scathing assessment of the medical education programs in the United States. Abraham Flexner was challenged or charged by the Carnegie Foundation to evaluate medical education in the entire country. And he visited all sorts of programs from the East Coast to the West Coast, including the University of Iowa. And he looked at the facilities, he interviewed the educators that were running these programs. And in 1910, this report came out, and it was, as I said, scathing. He said that there were low admission standards for most of the medical schools. They were using scientifically questionable curriculum, essentially saying that most of the curriculum was kind of quackery. We had poor facilities, and there was minimal exposure to clinical practice. He described the students sitting around having didactic discussions, and they never really actually evaluated how to practice medicine. He called for massive medical education reform, bringing science into medical education. He wanted to improve access to practical learning, and he wanted to establish a standardization of medical curriculum so that there was a little bit more of a science to the what is still somewhat of an art of practicing medicine. He recommended reducing the number of medical schools from 155 to 31. I would say that wasn't reduction, probably slashing the number of medical schools. He wanted to increase the prerequisites that were required to enter medical training. He recommended that we train physicians in a scientific manner, and that really medical education in medical schools needed to be setting forward the research that underpins the practice of medicine. And he wanted to give medical schools control of the clinical instruction in hospitals. Next slide. So how did the University of Iowa come off in his assessment? Well, we were trying to adopt the scientific principles of medicine, so that was a good point. We had integrated didactic lectures with clinical care, a good point. But he said the University of Iowa was very short in supply of patients, and that was really limiting the success of that clinical practice of medicine. We had outdated facilities and utilized a part-time clinical faculty that were unaffiliated with the hospital. Basically, it was physicians that were in the community that showed up in the hospital, and the students had a very unformulaic exposure to medicine. We didn't fare very well, and it was a fairly harsh report that was delivered. But one of the things that was really remarkable at that time was the state legislature really galvanized forces. They joined with the State Board of Educators and the university, and they decided that they had a stepwise plan to address this. They passed in 1915 the first state indigent care laws. And what that did is it brought indigent patients to the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. Very much the paradigm that we have today. We are the largest state safety hospital in the state. Next slide. At the same time, the university took to heart the need to improve facilities, and 3 separate buildings were built. In 1919, the medical education building opened, the state psychiatric hospital opened, and the children's hospital opened. Now, unlike that one hospital that opened earlier, these all 3 moved to the west side of campus. So this was the origin of the medical campus that we have today. Specialty care also became the standard for medical practice here at the university. We had a separate department of pediatrics, a separate department of urology, and a separate department of neurology. Today, that is very important in the practice of medicine, as it's become very specialized and very unique. And so the training has gotten much longer and much more intricate for specialty care. Next slide. In the 1920s, we opened 2 more buildings, the medical laboratory building and our 900-bed general hospital opened in 1928. What is remarkable, as I've told you now, in the span of 10 years, almost 100 years ago, we opened 5 buildings. 4 of those buildings are still in use today. They are a little antiquated, somewhat beautiful. If you look at the tower of the General Hospital, that's been preserved. It's been covered up a little bit, and the historians and the architects aren't so happy about that. But these buildings still are foundational to our campus. They're getting a little long in the tooth, though. Next slide. I want to talk about, I told you that Flexner said that it was really important that medical schools and university hospitals really focus on setting the science of medicine forward. And that is something that has been true in the University of Iowa College of Medicine and the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. The whole history of these combined programs has been to be innovative and state-of-the-art. These are just two very important findings. In 1935, the University of Iowa was the first to record human brain activity with an electroencephalography system. Today, neurosciences is one of the very important research institutes here at the University of Iowa, setting the field forward every day. In 1939, Elmer DeGowan, who was one of the hematologists in the Department of Internal Medicine, started to figure out how can you preserve blood so that you can have stocks of blood available when there's a surgery that needs, the patient needs transfusion, when there's trauma. And he figured out ways to store the blood in cold circumstances and also to add chemicals and salts to make the blood stable over long periods of time. And that resulted in the whole concept of blood banking. And now, as you well know, we use blood on a routine basis in medicine. And without blood banks, we couldn't keep those operating rooms and the trauma centers moving. Next slide. In the 1940s, this is a fun story and one that has continued significance for the College of Medicine, is Kate Dawn, who was the head of the Department of Nutrition, was talking to one of the doctors in rehabilitation sciences. So I have a terrible headache. And he goes, well, take some aspirin. You know, it's really good for headaches. And she goes, I can't take aspirin. It's really hard on my stomach. And so he kind of pondered that and thought about the chemistry of aspirin. For those of you that don't remember, the chemical name is salicylic acid. It's an acid, it's harsh on the stomach. And he said, well, you know, maybe if you add a buffering system to it, it'll be even better for the stomach. It won't be so harsh. And so he went to the lab and he figured out how to compound aspirin with a buffer and ended up creating the paradigm for buffering, which is today available in every drugstore in the United States and around the world. So a fun new discovery. Next slide. Today, 150 years later, our tagline for the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics and the University of Iowa Healthcare is changing medicine, changing lives. It brings together our what we call tripartite mission: patient care, research, and medical education. And that's what makes up academic medicine. And University of Iowa Healthcare is that tripartite amalgamation of the hospitals, the college, and then the physicians that make up the practicing body for the hospital. Today, women represent half of the college's student body. We have over 1,400 faculty, started out with 8. And the research is one of our very important homeworks. Last year, we brought in over close to $250 million in research funding. So you can see that there's a long and storied history. It continues today. A lot of the practices that started very early are now foundational for the College of Medicine and University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics.
Dr. Winokur, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. I am fascinated by the history of the College of Medicine, the formative years and the remarkably explosive growth, especially after World War II, in terms of the standards of science and medical practices. It's a really remarkable story. A couple of interesting questions I wanted to pass along to you, Dr. Winokur. This really dovetails nicely with that last information slide you presented to us. Do you, in your position, do you see patients in addition to teaching and serving as an administrator? And how do you manage your time? That's a pretty full plate, I think.
So I am not actually in the clinic seeing patients. I am in the research unit seeing patients right now. I have run a very active vaccine research unit. And so that's where I'm seeing a lot of my people. But it is a challenge. And one of the things that is true of most of our physicians is they are balancing a very active clinical practice. Many of them are still very active instructors, not only on the wards, but sometimes didactics as well. And many of them are doing a lot of research. So there's a lot of hours in the day that are spent here. I'm often home in the dark, but that's okay. Doing good work.
Your legacy at Iowa, would you be willing to share a bit about your father, George Winokur's work here?
Yeah. So,
I wondered if there was a connection.
there is a connection. And one of the fun things for Samantha is when I grew up in Iowa City. Many people don't know that. And my father was the chair of psychiatry, but down the street was Frank Conroy. And as I left for college and medical school, but I had a lot of interactions with different faculty around the university. I was recruited back to join the residency program in internal medicine. I brought my husband, who's a pediatrician. We stayed for training in infectious diseases, and he went into peds cardiology. And then we left again, and then we were recruited back. But each time, I came back, I kept seeing all these people that I had grown up with. Marilyn Robinson was my neighbor when I moved back to Iowa City. We walked our dogs together. She often, while reading a book, I was a little more conscious of trying not to trip over my feet. And so I didn't read as I was walking the dog, but we would cross. So it's kind of fun. And that's one of the things about Iowa City, is that you do have this ability to meet so many people. My dad was the department chair in psychiatry. One of the things that he did is he brought biologic psychiatry to the University of Iowa, and really, I think, established this program as one of the finest in the country. Today, we have some amazing psychiatric research that continues, and trying to understand the science of schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, other disorders that are very common in the population today.
Thank you very much again, Dean Winokur. I would like to invite our other two speakers back on and ask all three of you to stay with us for these last few minutes of our session this evening. We do have a few more questions to check in on, and I would like to, Quinn, if you're still there, I wanted to check in with you about a question that one of our participants has. The name Jack Trice, you may be familiar, and I'm sure many of our participants are familiar, a very noted and very tragic episode at Iowa State College, as it was known at the time, in, I believe, 1923. This was a game, I believe, football game played, I believe, at Minnesota. And unfortunately, Jack Trice died as a result of injuries following that game about 2 days later. According to witnesses at the time, that Minnesota players had deliberately attacked him on the field. And it's a very compelling, very tragic story, but he is rightly honored today at Jack Trice Stadium at Iowa State. What are your thoughts about Jack Trice's legacy, and do you think that might be a documentary topic?
Yeah, no, absolutely. His is a really interesting story as well, and I'll tell you, back then, it wasn't uncommon for players to pass away from injuries to staying playing football. It was, now there's so many rules involved, right? But it's still, it's just a violent game. And back then, the play didn't stop when the whistle blew. The play didn't stop until the player with the ball stopped moving. So it was very violent. So just imagine, being a Black player where you weren't wanted on the field. So obviously they put extra sauce into it, as far as delivering blows and things like that. So it's very unfortunate. It's a really compelling and interesting story. And that is absolutely a story that probably should be told at some point.
So thank you, Quinn. Question for Professor Chang. Could you speak a bit to the International Writing Program and future plans for the program? I know that technically it's a program separate from the Iowa Writers Workshop, but it has roots in the workshop, thanks to Paul Engel and his wife, Lan Engel.
Yes, Paul Engel and his wife Walling Engel lived in Iowa City for years when Paul was directing the Writers Workshop. And after he was director of the workshop, he was not ready to stop sort of moving and shaking the literary world. He established a program, the International Writing Program, really the only program of its kind in the world. And it brings writers from all over the world to Iowa City for, at this point, a 10-week residence, usually in the fall. Although I will say that I have been less in touch since the pandemic. I know that Chris Merrill, the current director of the program, who is a tireless worker and traveler, has had to sort of change the schedule a little bit. Usually they come in the fall, but because of the pandemic that made travel impossible, there was a bit of a hold on the program, people coming for a year, and it's been slightly different. I think the program is, very remarkable. And one of the things it does for our program is it creates an international community, sort of above and beyond the largely American writers who come to our program. Although we do have many international students, these writers who come are professional writers, and they live in Iowa City for 10 weeks, and they just experience life in this town, and they get to know each other and have, formative and wonderful creative experience that they can then remember. The program, many of the writers who come are funded by the State Department. That is something that makes it different from the other writing programs on campus. And the other interesting thing about it is the sort of degree of accomplishment of the writers who come. I mean, we are hosting, some writers who go on to become world famous, and they all remember their time in Iowa City very fondly.
Thank you very much, Sam. Dr. Winokur, hearing Quinn talk about injuries on the field, this is an intersection of athletics and medicine, I would suppose. What support does University of Iowa hospitals and clinics provide to Iowa student athletes today?
Yeah, so actually, I think the football program is one of the reasons why the University of Iowa Orthopedics Department started the sports medicine program. It's a very important, I think, support system for the football program and the other athletes as well, wrestling, basketball, others. There is a lot of need for medical supervision. It's hard for a player to not want to go back on the field. You need someone that's willing to be that arbiter. Sometimes that's what they're doing. And there's a lot of research going on now in athletic injuries. Why do the women basketball players have more knee injuries than the men? That's an important topic of research. There's a lot of interest in studying traumatic brain injury. Unfortunately, that's been not uncommon in football, much better than it used to be for all the reasons that Quinn said. But I think it's been a really mutually beneficial relationship.
I'm familiar with the sports medicine unit on campus, and it's a tremendous service to have, not only for athletes, but for the general public as well. Thank you very much, Dean Winokur. I have also a question, Dean Winokur, which I don't expect you to know the answer to. I certainly don't, but I would like to know who the first African-American faculty hired in the College of Medicine was and what year. I don't know off the top of my head. Okay, I will look into that. Whoever composed that question, please email me directly and I'll check into that for you. I can tell you the College of Engineering was Philip Hubbard. I don't know beyond that who might have been so serving in the College of Medicine. But thank you for the question, and I hope we can get that resolved for you. But send me an email directly, and I'll do my best to look that up for you. Boy, this question could come from me as well. Professor Chang, do you have a prescription for writer's block?
Goodness. Wow. I just don't think it helped. I mean, okay, my predecessor, Frank Conroy, taught all of us when we were in the program that we were supposed to get up every day, sit down in the same place at the same time and work for 3 hours, and that we could not break that ritual, and it was essential to keep writing even when the work was terrible, because you write through all of the bad work and then there's good work. I have not had success with that in recent years. I think when I was just starting out, it was really helpful for me to sort of force myself to sit, but I went through a period when, yeah, I just didn't, I would write gobbledygook. My, my strategy now is more complex when I'm advising people about writer's block. I really think it helps to take a little time away from writing, to just take a break and try not to force yourself and beat yourself up about it. I don't really see how that can help.
That's good advice. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Question for Quinn. How did you discover that you had a passion for film and screenwriting? And what is the second part of that question would be, what's the toughest part of that process in the creation of the documentaries that you make?
Yeah, so what happened was, I'd mentioned my mother earlier, and she wrote a book about our family history. So my great-grandfather, 7 generations removed, was a man named Sherrod Bryant, and he was a free man of color during the time of slavery in the antebellum South. And he sold himself into indentured servitude and then went on to become one of the wealthiest landowners in the South. Really interesting story. She had asked me to, publish the book for her because she couldn't because of her Alzheimer's. And so I did that, and 100% of the proceeds from that book goes also to the Alzheimer's Foundation that I created in my mom's name. But what I did was I sat down. It's interesting listening to Dr. Chang's hypothesis and talking about what she's learned as far as writing, because I wrote this I sat down and I wrote this 200-page thing. Didn't know what I was doing. I sent it off to a script doctor, and the woman told me, she said, "Good job. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end." And then she told me how crappy the script was. So she basically gave me some things to go work on. And then, 6 years later, I've written just a bunch of screenplays, and I didn't realize how much I enjoy the process. And I'll tell you, Dr. Chang, I wake up every morning, and the first thing I do is I open my computer and I write. It might not be for 3 hours. And like you said, sometimes I'll write some stuff and I'll be like, what is that? And I'll throw my computer, but it's the process of doing it. And it's like anything else, right? You sharpen your tools and you work at it, and it's repetition. And the more you do that, the better you get at it. And so I've really enjoyed the process. I'll tell you, the documentary process, that was me just winging it. I had no idea what I was doing. I watched a lot of documentaries. I got some advice from various people, and I just went for it. And fortunately, it turned out well, and I learned a lot. during the process. And, you know, I've always been one, I've always believed in fake it till you make it, right? So part of it was that. And now, you know, I'm kind of on my way with it, and just very appreciative of a lot of people around me that could help guide me and show me what I was doing wrong and help me to do things in the right way.
That's really great advice. Thank you both, and for those insights on the creative process. A friend once told me, and I've heard this frequently at conferences I've attended, that perfection is the enemy of good enough. That you don't really need to worry about being a perfectionist on the first round or the first draft, and just write it down. Just no matter how crappy you think it might be, go ahead and write it down. You can go back to it later and work on it further and refine. I don't know how many years it took me to figure that out, and I think I'm still figuring it out for my own writing, but I really appreciate the advice from you both for that. Let me check back now on additional questions. Again, for Professor Chang, what does it mean to you that the University of Iowa is ranked in the top 10 for writing across all disciplines? This is a new ranking that the U.S. News and World Report people have been issuing just in the last couple of years, I believe. We're not only talking specifically about the Iowa Writers Workshop, but interdisciplinary instruction in writing, such as in the College of Business or elsewhere. And we'd be interested to know from you what that means to you in your role as director of the workshop.
I think it's thrilling. I think that it makes me very happy to think that this university's investment in writing over the decades is now being recognized, and that people who are interested in communicating to each other through writing can come to our university knowing that they're entering a space where writing is taken seriously. I also think that writing is one of the most, if not the most important factor to succeeding in an actual job setting. I think that the ability to communicate through the written word is one of the reasons that University of Iowa graduates will have a leg up. I just think it's great. It makes me feel really good.
It is a wonderful attribute, and not only do workshop participants benefit, but across all disciplines.
Yes, and at the hospital, they have a conference every year about narrative medicine, and it's groundbreaking. It's really good that people see the University of Iowa as the writing university.
Thank you. Quinn, if we can go back to you for a moment. Someone wants to know about some of the items in your background. Looks like an interesting instrument resting against the wall behind you, and items you can tell us about.
Which one?
Well, yes, that. Someone speculated it's a didgeridoo, or
Yes. Yeah, okay. It is. I had a friend who went to Australia many years ago and brought that back for me, and I'll have to tell you, I haven't had much success in learning how to play it. But it's just art at this point. But I love it, and yes, that's my didgeridoo. Yeah.
At some point, you can make the art as music, and we'll look forward to hearing it, perhaps.
Exactly. Okay.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your time this evening. We have a closing question for all three of you. What are you most excited about as you think about the University of Iowa's future, whether in your own capacity specifically or in general? And anyone could go first.
I'll go. I'll tell you, and I tell people this all the time. I feel very fortunate to be a part of the University of Iowa family. I went to school there many years ago. My freshman year was 1983. I graduated in 1987. And it's still a family atmosphere. I go back all the time. I'm invited to speak and do different activities there. And sometimes I just like to go and visit with, people that I've met through the years and friends and teammates. And, it's like my second home. And I think a lot of people don't have this sort of experience, but I did, and I feel very fortunate to be a part of it. And I think moving forward, I think they're always trying to improve in different areas. And, just the things that are available there academically, it's just phenomenal. Just the medical center that's there. I had a great experience in the art program, the film school there, and forgive me if I'm missing anything, but on and on. And I think that it's just a phenomenal place. And I feel very fortunate to have been able to attend there, and, can't wait to come back this upcoming year.
Can't wait to see you again. Please come back often. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you.
Professor Chang, Dean Winokur, either of you would like to respond?
Sure. When I first came here, I was a 26-year-old wannabe writer with, zero experience as a writer, except for a couple of stories in this like extremely hopeful and anxious, need to make writing part of my life. And I will never forget the generosity of this community, and the way that I was, for example, given a TA-ship in rhetoric that enabled me to support myself and help pay my tuition while I was, pursuing an extremely impractical profession, and the encouragement and just kindness that was extended to me, not simply by my workshop friends and teachers and the staff at the workshop, who are all wonderful, but by the entire community of Iowa City, which I think is one of the most wonderful places in the country. And I'm so glad I live here. And basically, I just think this university has something very special going for it. I feel sometimes like maybe because people are from the Midwest, they don't brag about how great it is as much as maybe they could or should, but maybe that's part of what's so great about it also. Yeah, I'm a big fan.
Thank you, Professor Chang. Dean Winokur?
And, I think the thing that makes all of us better in the College of Medicine is the strengths around the university. And, the buzzword in, medical research now is team science. And watching some of these teams gel that are bringing in engineering, they're bringing in the College of Business, they're bringing in the arts. It's been really fun to watch this kind of creative process and people feeding their ideas together to come up with new ideas and new approaches. And that's what makes the University of Iowa really special. Is in a way, it's nice to be a little bit smaller. I think we can contact each other. There's open door policies. There aren't as many egos here. And so that makes those team questions answerable and makes us special.
Very well said. Thank you very much, Dean Winokur. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you all very much for your time this afternoon or evening, depending on where you may be. Let me first thank our three featured guests for this afternoon, Professor Chang, Dean Winokur, Mr. Early. I learned a lot about our institution's history this afternoon and the opportunities before us, and I hope all of you who participated have as well. I'd also like to thank all of you who registered to attend today. This session would not have been possible without your support. Thanks also to Heather Walensky, Nikki Bontrager, Tony Hicks, Derek Harrigan, and Ben Hill for their technical and editorial support this afternoon. Tonight's recording will be uploaded to the University of Iowa's Center for Advancement's YouTube page. And this will be online, hopefully in the next within the next 2 weeks, in case you would like to share it with your friends and family. If you enjoyed tonight's session, you can register to join us next week too, as we talk about some of the remarkable research that the university has been a part of. We'll be joined next week by Bruce Gantz, a 4-time Iowa alumnus, 4 times, that's 4 degrees from the University of Iowa, a professor of otolaryngology who also happens to be the world's first doctor to perform a robot-assisted cochlear implant surgery. Also joining us next week will be Kevin Washburn, who is Dean of the University of Iowa College of Law. Dean Washburn will speak on some of the remarkable research and practical applications of the law made possible through the college. And also joining us next week will be Ed Wasserman, experiential psychology professor whose work on innovation was recently featured in the Iowa Magazine. Those of you who have registered to attend next week will receive some advanced readings from our speakers on Friday. Watch for that. And you are welcome to send in questions ahead of time. If you wish, you may send those in advance to Heather Walensky, our podcast producer. Thank you very much again for your support of the University of Iowa. Thank you for joining us this evening. And again, to our 3 featured guests, our special thanks to you for participating.